In the early decades of 19th century America, a moment of desperation and deceit gave birth to one of the most haunting and fateful stories of its time, when a powerful countess bound by pride and fear made a choice that would alter destinies, forever her heart heavy with loss and the pressure of legacy. She found herself confronted with the unbearable reality that her newborn child had not survived the cruel hand of fate, but to preserve her name, her husband's honor, and the illusion of divine blessing, she turned to the unthinkable, a desperate pact forged in secrecy with one of her enslaved servants, who had also given birth at the same time. The woman, though bound by chains of servitude, carried a mother's heart and a love for her child that transcended her condition. Yet under the weight of coercion and fear, she was made to surrender her newborn to the mistress's arms, while taking in return the lifeless infant of the countess, who would be buried under her name. And sorrow thus began a life bound in deceit. A child of blood and pain raised as noble, while another born into privilege was denied his birthright and thrown into the shadows of bondage. The act, though done in silence, set in motion ripples that neither woman could control, for in that moment 2 lives were exchanged and 2 souls condemned to paths that were not their own. The countess who had orchestrated the exchange sought comfort in illusion, holding the child and convincing herself that the lie was mercy, that the child of her servant could grow into the mold of nobility without anyone suspecting the truth. Yet the past does not rest quietly, and the countess, though outwardly proud, felt the ghost of her sin follow her every smile, every word, and every gaze into her son's eyes. For in those eyes she saw not the blood of aristocracy, but something deeper, something unspoken that reflected the heritage of a mother enslaved and a father unknown. And while she tried to suppress it, society's whispers grew, and the boy's features, his mannerisms, and his natural empathy marked him as something other than what the world believed. Still, the countess carried on, weaving the lie into every breath and binding her heart in silence, because to reveal it would destroy everything. The enslaved mother, meanwhile, lived in the cruel irony of knowing her blood walked free, while she remained in chains, her arms empty, but her spirit still strong. She watched from afar, glimpsing the life that should have been her child's and enduring the agony of seeing her own flesh treated as noble, while she herself was denied humanity. Yet, though the lie had taken everything, it could not erase the bond of truth that connected them. Across distance and silence, time carved its cruel lines, and as years turned, the children grew into their places, one believing himself born to privilege and another forced to carry burdens meant for none, their destinies sculpted by a secret neither could imagine. But the soul remembers what the world forgets, and blood calls to blood even when tongues stay silent. The young man raised as noble often felt displaced. Restless, uneasy with the grandeur around him, he was drawn to those in chains. Moved by a compassion that defied the class he was taught to defend, in time the weight of the secret began to crack beneath its own burden, and fate, as though insulted by human arrogance, began to reveal its truth in subtle ways through rumor, coincidence, and tragedy. And as generations passed, the lie became a curse, whispering through hallways, haunting portraits, and turning triumph into misfortune. The noble family began to crumble under scandals, deaths, and betrayals, as though the pact that started it all demanded repayment for every breath stolen, every truth buried, and every love denied. And so the dynasty that once stood tall on the pillars of power and deception found itself eroding into dust, all because of that single night of fear and pride. The countess in her final days looked upon her son with eyes full of torment, knowing that though she had given him the world, she had stolen his soul's truth, and that in doing so she had doomed not only herself but all who came after her. Thus, the tale of the baby exchange is not merely one of switched identities, but of how power bends morality, how desperation blinds the heart, and how a single act born from grief can poison generations. It speaks of 2 mothers, one with a crown and one with chains, each bound by love and loss, each guilty and innocent in her own way. One forced to live with the shame of her deceit, and the other forced to endure the theft of her child. And though history may forget names, it does not forget the cost of injustice in this pact of blood and sorrow. 2 children were robbed of their destinies, and 2 lineages intertwined by fate and deception, leaving behind a legacy of guilt and tragedy that no wealth nor title could ever cleanse. For in the end, truth, though buried, will always find its way to light. As the years passed and the silence of the secret grew heavier, The truth began to stir beneath the surface like a ghost restless in its grave. For though time can bury lies, it cannot erase the trace of what has been done. And the exchanged children, now grown into men, walked paths that destiny itself seemed eager to correct. The young man raised in nobility carried within him a gentleness, a humility that clashed with the arrogance expected of his class, while the one born to privilege, but raised in bondage, held an unyielding pride and fire that no chain could break their souls. Recognizing a misalignment, neither could name it, was as though the blood within them whispered in defiance of the stories they had been told. The nobleman, drawn to the plight of those enslaved, began questioning the foundations of his world, feeling a strange kinship with the very people society told him were beneath him, and in that awakening the seeds of truth began to sprout. The countess, aged and frail, saw the signs she had long feared: her son's compassion, his restlessness, his refusal to accept cruelty as order. All spoke to the heritage she had tried to bury beneath silk and ceremony, and though she tried to dismiss the unease, her heart knew that the past was reaching for her through him. The enslaved mother, too, had grown older and more silent, yet her eyes still carried the weight of what she had lost, and in moments of solitude she whispered prayers to a God who seemed to dwell between mercy and justice, hoping that one day the truth would be known, not for revenge but for peace. For in her soul the wound of that exchange had never healed. Her love for her stolen child remained as fierce as the day she birthed him, and her sorrow was tempered only by faith that truth in its own time would rise. Rumors began to circulate among the servants and townsfolk, whispers that the countess's son bore an uncanny resemblance to someone from the quarters, that his gestures and speech held traces of another life, the kind of talk that courts disaster in a society built on hierarchy and bloodline. Yet the more they tried to silence it, the more the whispers grew, carried like smoke through corridors, until even the young man himself began to wonder at the shadows in his own reflection. And one night, in a quiet conversation overheard by chance, he learned enough to shatter the world he had known. The revelation came not in thunder, but in silence. And that silence was more violent than any storm, for it unraveled everything he had believed about himself, his mother, and the world that surrounded him. The countess faced her son's gaze, and in that moment she saw the judgment of truth, not from the heavens, but from her own creation. His eyes, once filled with trust, now burned with betrayal and sorrow, and she understood that no love could survive a lie so deep. She confessed everything with trembling lips, recounting the night of the exchange, the stillborn child, her fear of scandal, and her desperate plea to the enslaved mother. She spoke of regret, but regret cannot undo the past. It only sharpens the pain. The son listened in silence, feeling as though his very name had been stolen from him, that his life had been built on the grief of another. He could not hate her, but neither could he forgive, for the revelation had stripped him bare, leaving only the raw truth that identity cannot be borrowed nor forged. Meanwhile, the enslaved son, who had lived in bondage all his life, learned through fragments of gossip that the noble heir bore his blood, and in that cruel irony he found both rage and sorrow. For while he had toiled and suffered, another had lived the life meant for him. Yet even in his anger he could not bring himself to wish harm on the man who unknowingly carried his birthright. He knew that both were victims of a sin committed long before they could choose their paths. And so when fate brought them face to face, the meeting was one of recognition, not hostility. Their eyes meeting across the gulf of injustice that separated them, they saw in each other a reflection of what might have been two lives intertwined by the cruelty of a choice made in fear. The revelation, once it escaped the confines of family secrecy, spread like fire through the community, and society turned its cold judgment upon the dynasty that had once stood untouchable. Scandal tore through their name. Wealth could not buy silence, and the lineage that had been built on deception began to crumble. Reputations fell, alliances dissolved, and the family once envied became a cautionary tale, whispered at gatherings about how pride and fear can destroy even the mightiest among them. The countess faded away, consumed by guilt. Her fortune squandered, her name tarnished, and her legacy poisoned by the truth she had tried to hide. But the deeper tragedy lay not in the ruin of wealth, but in the ruin of identity. Two men, each forced to live under the shadow of what was stolen from them, each carrying the weight of lives that were never theirs. They could not exchange their places back, nor undo the years that shaped them. They were forever bound by a secret neither had asked for the truth. Though revealed did not bring peace, it brought understanding and pain, a bitter kind of justice that restored nothing, yet illuminated everything, and so the dynasty, once gilded with power, became a monument to the cost of deceit, a reminder that, no matter how carefully one constructs a lie, time will always uncover it. And when it does, the truth demands its due in tears and loss, and in the silent breaking of hearts. The revelation of the deadly pact did not simply destroy a family. It shattered the illusion upon which their entire world had been built. For decades, the dynasty had stood as a pillar of wealth, influence, and power, their name spoken with admiration, their fortune envied by all who gazed upon their grand estate. But when the truth emerged, when whispers hardened into undeniable fact, the dynasty crumbled like glass under the weight of its own deception. Every corner of their home, every portrait, and every heirloom became a reminder of the sin that had birthed their legacy. And no matter how deeply they tried to bury the past, it rose again, demanding recognition and retribution. The lie that began with one desperate act had grown roots that spread through generations, poisoning bloodlines and turning blessings into curses. The countess, who had once walked among the elite with head held high, now found herself abandoned by the very society she had sought to please. They looked upon her, not with respect but with scorn, whispering of madness and moral decay. She retreated into silence, haunted by visions of the child she had buried and the life she had stolen from another. Every echo of laughter in the halls became an accusation. Every tear that fell reminded her of the mother she had wronged and the son she had deceived. She realized too late that her attempt to control destiny had only provoked it, and that the gods of justice move not with haste, but with certainty. Noble son, unable to bear the shame of his false lineage, wandered from the estate seeking redemption in service and solitude, leaving behind titles and riches that now felt like chains forged from another's grief. The true-born child raised in bondage found little solace in truth, though he now knew who he was and what had been stolen from him. The knowledge brought no freedom for the law, and the world cared little for truth when power was involved. He remained an outcast in the eyes of society, a man caught between two worlds belonging to neither. And though some tried to make amends, offering him inheritance and apology, he rejected it, for he understood that no amount of gold could erase the years of humiliation, pain, and labor. He had endured. His freedom came not through wealth but through acceptance of the truth, and through his refusal to let the cruelty of others define him. Yet even in his strength, the wound remained deep. The realization that life itself had been a stage upon which others had played their deceit, leaving him to bear the consequence of a story written without his consent. As time passed, the dynasty continued to decay. Its lands divided, its halls abandoned by heirs who could no longer carry the burden of a cursed name. Generations later, the story of the baby exchange became legend, a whispered cautionary tale told by servants and townsfolk, a ghost story of greed, pride, and divine retribution. Travelers passing the ruined estate would speak of strange lights flickering in windows and voices crying in the wind, as though the spirits of the wronged still roamed the grounds, searching for peace. Some said they saw the countess weeping beneath the old oak tree where she had first made the fateful decision. Others claimed to hear the cries of infants carried through the night. Whatever the truth, the legend endured, because it spoke to something deeper than superstition. It spoke to the human truth that every act of deceit leaves an echo, and that no lie, no matter how carefully crafted, can escape the reach of time. The fall of the dynasty served as a grim reflection of the society that had enabled it, a world built on the divisions of blood and class, where the worth of a soul was measured by birthright and not by heart. The story forced those who heard it to question the fragility of the order they believed unshakable, for if the noblest among them could be born of bondage, and the lowest born of nobility, what did that say of the structures upon which they stood? The revelation blurred the lines between master and servant, between power and submission, exposing the moral rot that lay beneath the polished veneer of civilization. And though many tried to dismiss the tale as rumor, its lessons could not be silenced. The dynasty had fallen, but its truth lived on, echoing through time as a warning that pride, when joined with fear, becomes a weapon that destroys not only the guilty, but the innocent. As well, in her final moments, the countess is said to have looked upon the portrait of her family and seen not the faces of nobility but the ghosts of those she had wronged, the mother who had lost her child, the son who had lost his identity, and herself. Now hollowed by regret, she whispered to the empty room words of repentance, but the silence gave no answer. For repentance offered too late cannot rewrite history. She died with the knowledge that her attempt to cheat fate had instead fulfilled it in the cruelest way possible, her dynasty gone. Her name cursed, her legacy remembered only as a tale of ruin. And so the deadly Pact of 1831 remains one of the most tragic stories of its age, not merely for its deception, but for the truth it reveals about humanity, that beneath every title and every chain we are bound by the same blood, and the same consequence, that no act, however secret, remains hidden forever, and that the greatest dynasties can be undone by the smallest lies. It is a story of mothers bound by love and sorrow, of sons bound by destiny, and of truth bound by time until the moment it demanded to be seen. And when it came, it burned away the illusion, leaving only what was real. And in that reckoning, the American dynasty, that once seemed eternal, was reduced to dust by the very hands that built it.